Hi everybody, Sharyl Attkisson here. Welcome to another edition of the Sharyl Attkisson podcast. Today, a fascinating interview with Dr. Simone Gold, the founder of America's Frontline Doctors, an organization of medical professionals that took the lead in the very early days of the COVID pandemic in questioning the misinformation being put out by the medical establishment and the federal government. It's always instructive to read the propaganda site Wikipedia on these topics because these pages, as I've written about extensively, are controlled by pharmaceutical activists posing as anonymous Wikipedia editors, violating the supposed terms of Wikipedia in their editing, but they do so with impunity because they control the pages that we're talking about to be sure to put forth particular narratives. If you read the Wikipedia narrative about Dr. Gold, and you can usually count on the truth being the opposite of what Wikipedia says on these topics. It says she's an American doctor, well, that's true, an anti-vaccine activist, founder of a right-wing political organization, America's Frontline Doctors, known, says Wikipedia, for spreading misinformation about the COVID-19 pandemic. Quite the opposite is true. This group of medical professionals emerged in the early days of the COVID pandemic to rightly question the misinformation and disinformation being distributed by the federal government and public health officials. She was ultimately arrested, arguably for her lead role in calling out the government on this misinformation and disinformation, and you'll hear her full story and also hear about her new book in this interview today. Here's Dr. Simone Gold. Could you begin by telling people what America's Frontline Doctors is?
Yes, we were birthed. It's a nonprofit charity that was launched in the summer of 2020 to combat all the misinformation, censorship, and propaganda. I should say disinformation, censorship, and propaganda that was being promulgated by our public health officials and legacy media. And independent doctors who recognized the propaganda got together. We called ourselves America's Frontline Doctors in the summer of 2020. Some of you will remember we stood on the steps of the Supreme Court and we announced, no need to live in fear. Masks don't work for tiny respiratory viruses. There's early treatment if you should need it or want it, and maybe not to take an experimental medication without it being properly tested. We then were heavily mocked, cancel culture, I would say medical cancel culture, and ridiculed and taken off of social media. And we were all targeted in our own ways. I was the founder. I was very, very heavily targeted for really till today, quite frankly. Everything we said back then has been proven true. We published three white papers in 2020 and 2021 outlining like the medical harms and the harms to our civil liberties from mandating shots. And literally everything we said in there is as true today as it was then. We predicted there'd be higher death rates in people who took the shots, which is what we're seeing. And what we do now, for the last several years is we fight in the courts where we take on medical freedom cases. We support litigants. So one big area we do is defending physician free speech. We file amici briefs on that.
Let me back up before we dig into more modern stuff that's going on today, because I think people will wonder, you were so prescient at the time and so on top of things so early. A lot of medical professionals joined in, but your organization was out there before it was, shall we say, cool. Can you tell people what you were doing before you started this organization?
For sure. Thank you, Sharyl, for the questions. I tend to go 100 miles an hour. So I graduated medical school when I was 23. I also went off to law school, graduated Stanford Law School, and I made my career practicing emergency medicine. I was board certified emergency medicine for about 25 years or so when, during 2020. And that's what I was doing. I was full-time as an emergency physician, and I had an awesome reputation, never been criticized, never been reprimanded, no malpractice complaints, very well respected, kind of a golden child, MD/JD. Could you imagine? Kind of a perfect reputation. I mean, please don't quote that. That sounds arrogant, but I'm just being shorthand. But, life was fine. But what we were seeing in 2020 didn't match up with the facts in many ways. One was what we were seeing in the hospitals. I'm an e-hospital doctor, was very different than what the media was reporting, and even what the coronavirus task force was saying. That was one disconnect. Another disconnect was that all of a sudden the doctors were saying crazy things, um, repeating what like the FDA would say or the NIH would say, things like hydroxychloroquine isn't safe, right? We weren't even having a debate about the efficacy. We were talking suddenly about it not being safe. I'm like, it's been FDA approved for 65 years. Are you joking? Like, it's one of the safest drugs on the planet. It's over the counter most of the world. So the fact that doctors were repeating propaganda was very disturbing. The third thing that concerned me was I, as a practicing physician in California, received a letter from the Medical Board of California, which is an executive branch, an agency under the executive branch, saying that if we doctors prescribed hydroxychloroquine, we could lose our license. So I was very alarmed as a physician, as a lawyer, that my right to practice was being absolutely infringed upon by bureaucrats, and also just the whole free speech angle of it. So all of those reasons, oh, I would say the fourth reason is that I saw nurses become what I call in my book casual cruelty, casual cruelty. They just started being cruel to patients because their employers were forcing them. So really good nurses were being told that, if a patient comes into the ER, deathly ill or dies, the family member couldn't come in. I mean, it was just insane. It was absolutely insane. So for these, I'd say four reasons, I started looking for other doctors who could see clearly, and that's how we got together.
Did it surprise you that the government was putting out so much misinformation and disinformation, and even the medical boards were jumping in and the medical establishment? Or did you have a taste of this before the COVID experience, that this could be something that would happen?
I've known for a long time that our system is does not really work to the benefit of the patient. Sometimes it helps the patient, but that's not really the goal to help the patient. It's a very bureaucratic system that is driven by other motives. But I was shocked because what I had seen until 2020 was a lot of kind of like bureaucratic delay in the system or over testing, CYA mentality, follow the rules, be one of the sheep, don't raise your head up. I'd seen that, but I'd never seen policies that were actually harmful and deadly to patients. And we started seeing that. And there are some specific examples. One of them is that Medicare patients who came in with COVID, if they were put on remdesivir and not put on ivermectin, the hospital would get a better financial payout. And I, to this day, can't figure out why not being an ivermectin should have influenced the payment. I kind of understand, corruption lobbying by the remdesivir manufacturers, right? That's at least understandable. It's a bad drug. It's highly lethal. It should never have been approved, authorized, or used. But at least I sort of understand that kind of corruption. But why would you have a clause in there that if they went on ivermectin, that was a precondition to getting a higher payment? That made no sense at all. It made no sense that we couldn't have relatives in with sick patients or dying patients. I'm talking about people with like a hip fracture. I'm not talking about COVID. It made no sense that, Governor Cuomo put COVID positive nursing home patients with COVID negative nursing home patients. The nursing home patients were the most vulnerable group. They were the only group that was really at risk as a group, right? They were always individuals. But, these policies were lunacy, and there were public health policies that contradicted everything else in Public Health 101. You never vaccinate in the middle of a respiratory pandemic. That's absolute Public Health 101.
And may I
Respiratory,
say, is that because the virus changes too fast for the vaccine to catch up with it and be effective?
yes, and you also want to have the healthier members of society get the virus because they kind of incubate it a bit, and the virus will weaken, and so then grandma won't die, like if the kids get it. So like you actually don't really, you want it to the extent that you would do anything in the middle of a pandemic, it would only be to protect the vulnerable. Like a rational policy, if we had had a shot that worked, would have been to offer it to nursing home patients. That would have been rational. But there was no rationality to offering to everybody. And you probably know this, but the numbers, young middle-aged people were never at risk of dying. If you didn't have multiple comorbidities and weren't frail, you were not going to die from this thing. So it was yes, it was absolutely shocking. Shocking. It's still and heartbreaking. Heartbreaking.
Well, I've written for years about, and I think this is a component of it, that propagandists started figuring out, particularly with the advent of the internet and social media, that any form of information that can be co-opted has been co-opted, and they figured out how to do it in a systematic fashion. We know that with Wikipedia, with Facebook, there's even documentation as to how they encroached, got Facebook to start doing the fake fact checks by the pharma shills. There's all kinds of things that have been bought out, but I think we maybe didn't think about medical establishment and how that had been bought out, the information, the pipeline that we were getting our information from. And they knew, meaning the propagandists, they rightly knew if they could control a few openings to the pipeline, we're talking about social media and medical associations and so on, that everything flows from that. And then if you go for the news, this is what I've written about more extensively, they've been able to co-opt sources like even Columbia School, Journalism School and Columbia University, these same propagandists that work for these interests. They donate a lot of money. They make sure that journalism is taught a certain way now so that it's biased when the kids come out of the gate. They think this is the right way to do things. They've bought out Associated Press, who uses bias. A lot of, I don't know if people know, a lot of news organizations take pretty much all their standard guidance from Associated Press, but they used to be a good organization where you could do that. Now there's feeding out narratives and propaganda and one-sided, sometimes false information, but someone's figured that out, that they can just get their foot in the door at AP. The online dictionaries, same thing. So I think this is a component of the same thing. Somebody figured out pretty quickly that, and they already had their foot in the door of the medical establishment and our public health agencies, but during COVID, this really paid off for them.
So it's interesting to have this conversation with you. Everything you're saying, of course, is exactly true. And medicine is a bit of a microcosm of all of that. We're kind of our own insular little world. And so the forces that affect us is how the billing is done, um, big pharmaceutical publications, I would say, because the journals are basically being paid for by big pharma. Um, I would say that it was tempered by the fact that medicine is usually practiced in a community where you know other people and other doctors. So you kind of run your thoughts by them. We didn't listen. I would say the average bedside clinician never listened to the NIH or CDC or FDA. Like it's just not relevant to our lives. I got that question a lot in 2020, 2021. But like this quote off-label thing, like we've never in our lives ever thought about that in that way as doctors. But we were co-opted. There's an excellent little YouTube video, Paul Blase. I could send it to you if you're interested in, but he was the guy who didn't get the directorship of the WHO. He was the French guy who went up against Tedros like 10, 12 years ago. And he had revealed that the Lancet had been bought out, and it was years ago. So the problem is also that doctors have become employees. That's a big part of the problem, Sharyl, is that in my dad's day, only maybe 15% of doctors at most were employees. Now it's flipped. 85% of doctors are employees. And certain specialties like pediatrics, their paycheck entirely depends upon complying with the government. But virtually all employees have to comply with the government because the government sets the payment structure through Medicare and all the private insurers follow them. So we were just ripe for the picking, quite frankly.
So what you're doing recently, and one reason we're here today is to talk about, you're about to file, I don't think you already have, two FDA citizen petitions regarding hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. Have those been filed yet? And tell me about them.
I have not, and this is a great story, and you're the first one I'm talking to about it because you do great journalism. I'm going to get back to you. I'm considering pausing 1 month to file them. They're all ready. Just because in 1 month it'll be the 5-year anniversary of the White Coat Summit. So I'm just kind of thinking about that. But there's a process in our government called the Citizens Petition to the FDA, where a citizen or citizen group can petition the FDA for bringing a drug from prescription status to over-the-counter status. It's actually a very interesting thing, and it's all in the draft we did, so you can read about it, how it works. But the most famous example of this ever being used by citizens was Plan B. So the manufacturers of the early abortifactants really didn't want to do it because of the social pushback they thought they would get. So citizen groups pushed for it, and that's how Plan B came to be over the counter. And there are other instances of this. So America's Frontline Doctors filed a citizen petition to make hydroxychloroquine over the counter in 2020. And it took the FDA 2 years to get back to us. And of course, eventually they denied it. But it seems to me the time is ripe to submit it. It's a new administration. The data is overwhelming, not just about COVID, but the data is overwhelming that the government doesn't mind interfering with Americans' ability to get medications. And I believe Americans should be able to have access to safe medications that are over the counter in much of the world and that our own government data shows are exceedingly safe. Hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin both fit that bill. Hydroxychloroquine is over the counter in most of the world. It is not over the counter in America, really, because there was no market demand for it. In America, it's for lupus and rheumatoid arthritis patients. Those patients typically always are seeing doctors anyway. And in other nations where malaria is an issue, it's over the counter. People just go into the store and buy it. No problem with it whatsoever. Ivermectin, as I'm sure you've heard, is there's a lot of excitement about ivermectin as a repurposed medication for other reasons. And it's very, very safe. So there's no reason people shouldn't be able to try that on their own. And as you probably know, 3 states have already made it over the counter. So our petition perhaps will be successful, right? We just want the federal government to do it. We've already had 3 states do it.
Well, interestingly, a lot of people are still getting their misinformation from the media, and even doctors don't seem to know how many studies are out there proving the effectiveness of the things that you're saying, these medicines for COVID in retrospect and many other things. So I urge people to look for alternative sources of information on the internet where they can read about this. You probably, have you published some of this at AFLDS, American
Yes,
Front?
but I'll give you the best sources. You probably know about it, but in case you don't, C19HCQ and C19IVM. It's going to blow your mind. You might even want to look right now. It's going to blow your mind. They've been tracking since the beginning, and there's hundreds and hundreds of studies that show this stuff works. Overwhelming amount of data. They started
So
publishing this in 2020.
I look forward to seeing what the petition holds. I also think it's weird because I've been going at the FDA for years over things that should have been looked at, such as artificial food dyes being removed from our food supply, red dye number 3, and so on. And they'll say, oh, we didn't have time to act on the citizen petition because we don't have enough personnel. Well, there shouldn't even have to be a citizen petition. There was so much evidence in that case. Why is the FDA waiting for citizens to petition things that they ought to be doing, that we expect our public health agencies to be looking out for, rather than us having to force their hand through, an onerous process?
Yeah, I can't speak to the food angle. I do think I don't want to. I do think the FDA. I think all three-letter agencies are honestly horrific. I'm not giving them a pass, but usually a drug manufacturer does bring the petition because there's a profit motive. So you'll be happy to know, like Motrin, Antivert, God, there's a long list. Nicoderm patches. Like these things used to only be prescription. And then the manufacturer said, oh, we can make money if we make them over the counter. So that's normally the way it's done. The problem with hydroxychloroquine is there's no money to be made over the counter. There probably is with ivermectin, because people are recognizing it as potential cancer treatments. But anyway, that's normally how it's done. But nonetheless, I did bring a citizen's petition and they denied it, right? And they had no basis to deny. They had no scientific basis to deny it.
Well, I look forward to how that turns out the next time, and we'll have you back on as that moves forward as well. But you recently released a new book. Was it just last week that
Yes.
selective persecution came out?
Yes. So the title is a play on prosecution, selective prosecution, and I'm an ER doctor, so selective persecution. The foreword is by Dennis Prager. The afterword is by Professor Dr. John Eastman, one of Trump's lawyers who really got hurt from the J6 stuff, and also an epilogue by Dr. Robert Malone. And it is really my story. I use my J6 experience to explain the subtitle, The Legalization of American Fascism, that we really have an infrastructure for fascism here in America. So every chapter goes through why I say that. What happened during COVID, what happened when the FBI came to arrest me, How is it possible? How is it possible that we have an FBI that would send a tactical SWAT raid? I don't know if you know all this, but like they broke my door down. There's 20 officers with huge weapons pointing at my chest, laser sight beams. I was handcuffed and shackled, perp walked in front of the neighbors. Like, in what universe could there have been any kind of calculation that I would need to be arrested by a SWAT team, right? So that wasn't ordered specifically by the president. There was an infrastructure that permitted that to happen. So that was, one chapter. How did it happen so quickly? The COVID tyranny.
Can we give a brief, I'd hate to move on without telling people briefly what happened to you. In other
Oh,
words,
sorry, yes. Yeah.
let me just summarize and you can elaborate or correct me. But on January 6th, as a believer in this free medical freedom and so on, you went inside the Capitol briefly, I believe, and spoke briefly and left. And as you say, were targeted by the FBI and arrested and went to jail. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and the only detail you missed on the J6 day was I had a government issued permit. So I was due to take the stage with two Congress people. I think it was Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar. Pardon? Three congressmen, right? And 20 people total. Lance Good and Lauren Boebert. Yeah, I guess there's like five different Congress people that were going to be on the stage that day. And me. I have the permit, it's in the book. Um, and anyway, when we presented ourselves to do the talking, they wouldn't let us talk. So I was there, physically present, had my speech in my hand, and the doors opened from the inside, and you can see me walk around the Capitol. You can see me giving my speech. Of course, I'm not violent. I walk around, I leave. That was my experience. 12 days later, a few days later, I was apparently put on FBI's most wanted list poster. That's good. Um, that's Mom was very proud.
Unbelievable.
It's crazy. I actually, somebody sent it to me. We were at dinner with friends, and I absolutely thought it was photoshopped. I mean, there's just no way this could have been serious that I am on an FBI most wanted poster. It was insane. But I still didn't think anything was going to happen. I mean, try to remember life before January 6th. I mean, if you were present at a protest, but you didn't do anything, nobody ever got arrested. And the summer of love, the summer before, like people were setting cop cars on fire and they weren't getting arrested. So it just never occurred to me. And then 12 days later, violent, terrible, horrific arrests. It's really traumatic, really terrible. I was taken to jail. So each of these episodes is a chapter. So what happened on J6? Why was I there? Speaking about COVID and what happened at the arrest, what happened when I went to jail. Then how did the judicial process play out? Because it went on for like a year and a half, I think, the judicial process. Then I'm standing before the judge, and turns out, Sharyl, it's pretty funny. The judge and I knew each other. I went to a very small law school. Stanford Law School is a class of 147. Casey Cooper. So he and I were classmates, he and I were friends, and he and I lightly dated. Right? Insane that he didn't recuse himself. Absolutely insane. That's also in the book. Then he sentences me to prison. Then the Bureau of Prison chooses to put me in a maximum. So this is why I wrote the book the way I did. What kind of system exists that could put a person like me in maximum prison? So when I got out, I did a lot of research. I said, what are the criteria to do an FBI SWAT team arrest? Well, are you part of a gang? Do you have a history of violence? Have you ever been arrested before? Do you have a job? How old are you? Are you on drugs? Like there's a long list of people that they send out, right? There's also a list of why you go to a minimum camp, why you go to a low, medium, or maximum. There's a list, right? Similar thing. Like, did you have a past incarceration? Are you employed? There's a whole long list. Are you on drugs? Of course, I met none of them. I'm the lowest risk ever that they've ever had. I was a misdemeanor. I went to prison on a misdemeanor trespass, and I was in prison for a misdemeanor. Misdemeanor. Wrap your head.
That's crazy.
Another episode that is an amazing chapter in the book is, as you may or may not know, about 350 J6ers were charged with a 20-year felony, which was done specifically to essentially force us all to take plea deals. I was never planning to take a plea deal. And then I learned I was charged with a 20-year felony. And you really can't, that's just irresponsible to say you're going to fight the DC system on it, right? So I ended up taking a plea deal. But this 20-year felony was a complete fabrication. It was a law, a very technical law, that was to close the Arthur Anderson loophole from the Enron scandal 20 years ago. And somehow they applied this to protesters at J6, it was such a miscarriage of justice. This was reversed at the Supreme Court in the Fisher case. Fisher was the reversal in June of 2024. But because of that pressure, that's actually specifically why I took a plea. So there's, of course, a chapter on that. There's California Medical Board coming after me. Congress came.
I don't know if it's the same one, but I interviewed another January 6th guy that was only found guilty of misdemeanor trespass, but was, arrested with a fully armed army of SWAT team FBI guys at his home that marched his teenage son out at gunpoint and his wife early in the morning, even when he'd already pledged to cooperate and had a lawyer. And, there was no reason to do this, obviously, but they were threatening to charge him with something greater. And I believe it was because they said if there's a public official on the scene in the vicinity, when you're doing even a misdemeanor trespass, they can elevate the charge. I mean, they found all kinds of ways to charge misdemeanor trespassers with more things.
It's called a terrorism enhancement. He could have been charged with the Fisher. He could have been threatened with a terrorist enhancement. You should know to coerce me to taking a plea deal, they did two things. One is they charged me with nonsense for this Fisher case, the 1512C2 statute, 18 USC 1512C2, which was reversed by the Supreme Court the summer of 24. That was a 20-year felony. That was heavy coercion. The other coercion they did to me specifically, they threatened to charge me with like assaulting a cop. Of course, there's zero evidence of that. So there you go. Like that is literally our system. Every single US prosecutor I directly observed, which was several lies, every single one, without exception. It was so disheartening as a physician, as an attorney. I mean, I believe in the law. Like the system's supposed to be that the prosecutors are supposed to be officers of the court. Every single one of them lies. Every single one of them. I didn't see any exceptions. There was the Department of Homeland Security set me up on a fake narcotics trumped up charge. That's an entire chapter. I've got video evidence of that. So it's quite something what I went through.
Well, you did. And I thank you for hanging in there because many people understandably crumble. They can't go on. They give in. They, duck their heads low and try to just stay out of the crosshairs because they can't take that kind of pressure. And I hope people listening to you understand how potentially dangerous it is when doctors are persecuted and prosecuted politically in order to keep them from speaking the truth or practicing honest medicine. I mean, this is a really dangerous situation that we had. I think a lot of eyes are opening, but it's important to hear. And I hope people will, and I'll look for your book as well, Selective Persecution.
I want to show you one thing because I know you're interested in this because you're a journalist. So when the California Medical Board came after me to pull my medical license, and they came after me entirely on free speech, the initial letter was December of 2021 saying I misspoke on hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. This was public speech. There's no allegation of patient complaint or even prescription writing. They just went after my public speech. Okay, so I fought them. I didn't even have to fight them, Sharyl, because I'd moved to Florida, and truthfully, I'm running the nonprofit. I'm not so much practicing, but I knew I'd be a good witness, and I knew I was a good case. 3 years, 3 years, 3 years. We won, and this has now made precedent in California that you can't go after physicians for free speech. I don't know if you knew, but they tried to pass a quote, no second opinion law, which Governor Newsom signed, and then he didn't. He let it lapse because it was so ridiculous. But they targeted me by name, California State Legislature, the California Medical Board, they targeted me, and it took 3 years and I won. And in fact, the judge ordered them to pay our fees. And so we're negotiating now. But it's a really important precedent.
You and other brave doctors went through a lot, and probably your legal background helped you a great deal in understanding all of this. But thank you so much for joining us. And I do hope people will look for your book. Thanks, Dr. Gold.
Thank you so much.